This video is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's up, everybody? Helen here with some thoughts about Stranger Things. The content overlords at Netflix finally dropped the end of season 4, and according to popular opinion, the Duffer Brothers stuck the landing. But while the show has been praised for maturing with season 4, it hasn't completely shaken criticism that it relies too heavily on nostalgia. Some see it as little more than a gumbo of references aimed at grown-up 80s kids. But in recent seasons, it's introduced plot points that confront the darker side of the 1980s, and nostalgia in general, choosing to actually examine the past instead of just serving up more of the warm and fuzzy nostalgia we've come to expect. And yet these two approaches, the comforting and the critical, are also diametrically opposed, which makes us wonder, can Stranger Things subvert the very nostalgia it also evokes? Let's take a look in this Wisecrack Edition, Can Stranger Things Nostalgia Grow Up? And spoilers ahead. But before we dive in, we want to thank this video's sponsor, BetterHelp. If you've been feeling anxious, overwhelmed, or depressed lately, BetterHelp can be an excellent resource to help you feel better. I personally can't remember a time when I didn't feel anxious or overwhelmed, and the constant barrage of bad news that seems to come every minute of every hour of every day now isn't making it easier. But thankfully, there are resources out there. BetterHelp's network of more than 20,000 therapists are ready to listen and support you. After completing a short questionnaire, you'll be matched with a therapist whose expertise fits your unique needs. And what's so great about BetterHelp, where everything is done remotely, is that you can work with a therapist whose skills might not otherwise be available in your area. Within 48 hours, you can start messaging your therapist at any time. When you do reach out, you'll receive timely and thoughtful responses in return. Additionally, you can schedule your choice of secure phone or video sessions to receive counseling in real time. In my case, I had my first session with Sarah scheduled 3 days after matching with her, and honestly, it was one of the best therapy experiences that I've ever had. She was so nice, so empathetic, and so knowledgeable, and I left with tools that I can use to help myself when I'm feeling super anxious. And if you and your therapist aren't a perfect match, it's easy and free to switch to a new one. So join the more than 2 million people who have taken in charge of their mental health with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/wisecrack or just click the link in the video description. When you do, you'll get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/wisecrack. And now, back to the show. Now, the Duffer Brothers have been open about how much they're borrowing from the films of yesteryear, specifically Steven Spielberg's, and they're not subtle. Stranger Things has been filled with references to 1980s movies from the jump, and has always shown just how saturated the kids are in the decade's pop culture.
What if the bad people kidnapped her? What if they're forcing her to say this?
I need you to answer.
Like Lando Calrissian. Don't answer.
Stranger Things is hardly the first TV show to peddle in nostalgia, but its salience today may be indicative of our times. Scholar Svetlana Boym calls nostalgia an incurable modern condition, describing its ubiquity as a defense mechanism in a time of accelerated rhythms of life and historical upheavals. That is to say, when our world is changing and the present feels precarious, like, right this f***ing second, we collectively experience what Boym describes as a yearning for a different time, the time of our childhood, the slower rhythms of our dreams. She noted way back in 2001 that American culture was becoming increasingly self-referential, as it sought solace in a simpler past. While the prevalence of nostalgia content makes sense, many remain skeptical about how Stranger Things uses it. Early on, the New York Times labeled Stranger Things as 80s karaoke. And while that's pretty harsh, especially if Don't Stop Believin' is your showstopper, the show is definitely preoccupied with that decade's surface-level aesthetic. There's the fashion, the toys, the technology, the public spaces. By saturating itself with all of the dressings of the 80s, the show fully makes use of its period setting, albeit in a way that often isn't relevant to the actual plot. Its focus on children and adolescents also makes it right for some of the strongest pop culture associations of the 1980s. As marketing scholars William J. Havlena and Susan L. Holick note, we tend to have the strongest nostalgic associations with media and pop culture from our adolescence, which is presumably true for the Gen Xers and older millennials who form a sizable chunk of Netflix's audience. And each moment in the 80s of Stranger Things is filled with all of the cool stuff we associate with the decade, creating an idealized version that all of us can pine for. And you could argue this idealism has grown stronger each season. Season 2 gave us a Gremlins riff with Dustin and Dart, and the whole small-town kids fight shady invading Russians thing in Season 3 is straight up Red Dawn. This left Season 4 feeling disjointed in its potpourri of genre tropes, lurching from zany Spielbergian comedy to a Silence of the Lambs ripoff. By overtly mirroring movies in its cinematography and narrative, the show is engaging in some good old-fashioned intertextuality. Or, in other words, it's creating a relationship by mapping itself onto an already existing work with the same tone. When Robin and Nancy's visit with an accused serial killer reminds us so vividly of Silence of the Lambs, we're reminded how we felt when we first saw Anthony Hopkins creep it up, and it puts us in that headspace. No Chianti required. And intertextuality engages with nostalgic media in a specific way. Scholar Frederick Jameson observes that in an age of remakes and nostalgic oversaturation, intertextuality displaces real history by substituting fact for aesthetic style, or pseudo-history. He writes that the nostalgia film was never a matter of some old-fashioned representation of historical content, but instead approached the past through stylistic connotation, conveying pastness by the glossy qualities of the image. Referencing the media of the past rather than the actual history is the priority. But not everyone watching Stranger Things today was even alive in the 80s. So what are they experiencing when they indulge in this virtual reconstruction of the decade? A little something scholar Arjun Appadurai calls armchair nostalgia, or ersatz nostalgia. That is, nostalgia without lived experience or collective historical memory. In his criticism of nostalgia-tinged advertising and merchandising, which Stranger Things has done its fair share of, Appadurai argues that such media creates nostalgia for things that never were. This imagined nostalgia thus inverts the temporal logic of fantasy, and creates much deeper wants than simple envy, imitation, or greed could by themselves invite. Interestingly enough, a lot of young people's nostalgia for the world depicted in Stranger Things is actually based on nostalgia for the 1980s movies that they watched in their youth, which defined that decade in their minds. Thus, a pseudo-history is born. And that's the thing about pseudo-history. It erases some of the uglier truths of the time period depicted. Sure, early seasons of Stranger Things are hardly all fun and games. There's a genuine darkness that underscores it from the get-go, most obviously the disappearance of a cute kid. But that darkness is defined by an unambiguous evil, rendering the conflict that ensues almost childlike in its simplicity. There's no empathizing with the Demogorgon, no matter what your fondness for Venus flytraps may be. Mind Flayer is more of the same. In this way, the darkness of the Upside Down in the first 2 seasons of the show threatens the essential lightness of the world above, and that threat only escalates as future seasons attempt to complicate the balance. Now, there's a strong case to be made that Season 3 of Stranger Things marked a turning point for the show's relationship with nostalgia, as it became less about reveling in the commercial delights of 1980s youth culture and ventured closer to critique. Obviously, there's still plenty of production design to make you pine for the 80s. Half the freaking season is set at a shopping mall, after all. But we learned that the mall isn't all fun and games. It's a sign of Reagan-era corporatization that's displacing tons of long-standing mom-and-pop shops. When intern Nancy points this out to the local newspaper, though, it's brushed off as a matter of course, unremarkable in pro-business Reagan-era America. What's more, unlike the earlier ambient nostalgia, this season's narrative revolves around real anxieties from the 80s. Most notably, you have the Cold War, and the USSR's army plays a key role as the show's first real human antagonist. They want to use the Upside Down to aid their Cold War agenda. They set up camp in a giant lab beneath Hawkins' Starcourt Mall, with the help of a colluding, power-hungry mayor who puts on a patriotic fair while facilitating a communist invasion. The Cold War paranoia about a covert Russian infiltration aided and abetted by politicians is thus realized, as well as Cold War-era anxieties that the Soviets would use mind control to turn Americans into commie zombies. And though there's plenty of fun to be had, it's arguably using nostalgia for mildly darker purposes than it has before. By making these elements central to the narrative, Stranger Things is seemingly acknowledging that the 80s might not really have been as simple and chill as its portrayal led us to believe. Surprise! It marks a deliberate effort to engage with the reality of the decade, which was not just one big game of Dungeons & Dragons. But while Season 3 tried to address darker aspects of the time, it didn't really pull it off. In theory, the way Stranger Things integrates issues like corporatization and Cold War anxieties removes some of the show's rose-tinted naivete, but it also introduces an element of whiplash that undermines its own premise. Nancy's newsroom critique of corporatization is quickly overshadowed by all the fun antics enjoyed at the mall. And when it comes to the Cold War narrative, the show ultimately settles for simplicity over complexity, resolving nuanced real-world issues by blaming everything on the spooky, unambiguously evil Russians and their monster friends. This invasion obviously, as we noted, draws pretty explicitly from the film Red Dawn, invoking the same happy nostalgia that it does for those of us who watched Spielberg films in the 90s. By letting us revel in the intertextuality, we can immediately conclude that the kids are going to triumph over evil. Intertextuality strikes again. Maybe the show was trying to critique that brand of feverish Cold War-era American media, but if so, it doesn't really signpost that intention. Mostly, it depicts the Cold War with a false sense of simplicity, just as warm and fuzzy nostalgia suggests a desirable simplicity of its own. So, in trying to critique its 80s setting, Season 3 still seems to conclude that the time was simpler than the present day. But if Season 3 tried and failed to critique 80s nostalgia, then Season 4 arguably embraces nuance in order to further its commentary on nostalgia at large. The most obvious way it does so is by invoking the Satanic Panic, a real-world 80s moral panic which sparked fears that things like Dungeons and Dragons or heavy metal music were leading kids to worship Satan, or, like, do ritual murders. Not coincidentally, both of those things were enjoyed by social outcasts and nonconformists. This added to the stigma and otherizing of folks who were already rendered pariahs by the conservative social norms of the decade. This was, after all, an era that looked back quite fondly on the rampant conformity of the 50s. And this clearly applies to our protagonists, who are prime examples of this sort of othering. Previously, we had seen our plucky adolescent friends being bullied or excluded, but this is the first real sense we get that nonconformity in Reagan-era America wasn't just socially unadvisable, it was potentially criminal, as plenty of folks convicted of dubious charges during the Satanic Panic could tell you. And whether it's for their interests or their identity or their mental health issues, Stranger Things asks us to care about folks who are in danger of 80s-style societal scorn. In a subversive twist, it is only the outsiders who are able to believe the truth, that a Dungeons & Dragons-style monster is on the hunt in Hawkins. Meanwhile, the jocks and cops all lead to the conclusion that the freak, Eddie Munson, is responsible for the murders. And during other moments on the show, some of the trappings of the 80s that might have once been celebrated become dark and troubling, like Eleven's horrible day at the roller skating rink, where a colorful, fun retro trope turns completely haunting. But arguably, the show's best exploration of the perils of nostalgia is in its preoccupation with trauma and mental health struggles. We know lots of people have been talking about this, but we think it's worth diving deeper as we examine whether the show can successfully subvert its own nostalgia. Most relevantly, there's Hopper'S backstory, which we finally learn. Like so many men of the era, his guilt and substance abuse issues were rooted in trauma from his service in Vietnam.
Ever since I was 18. There's some letter of induction in the mail. Uncle Sam wants me to go fight some war in the jungle.
We learned specifically that he was assigned to the Agent Orange division. Ostensibly an herbicide to remove Vietnamese defenders' tactical edge in the jungle, Agent Orange was also super toxic, causing widespread disability and birth defects. The US troops assigned to the Agent Orange Corps were kept in the dark as to its true nature, and many suffered its effects.
The horror followed us, clung to us.
Hopper blames himself for his daughter's cancer, and for not warning his wife about the risks caused by his exposure.
We had a baby and she was born healthy, she was perfect, Sarah. And then she died.
His resulting descent into substance abuse mirrors the experience of many Vietnam War veterans. Many struggled with PTSD or other mental health troubles, or were denied social services, or even ended up unhoused. Here, we see that not everything about the 80s is something to be nostalgic for. Coupled with the very real brutality of life in a Soviet gulag, we also see the darker, less cartoonish reality of the Cold War. Then, more abstractly, there's Elle's season arc, which sees her literally reliving her younger life under the care of Papa. And this serves as a good reminder that not everyone would be stoked to return to their childhood. And in some of the season's most powerful scenes, we watch as she delves into her most horrific memories of a massacre at the lab. The pain of reliving her trauma feels equal and opposite to the nostalgic joy viewers might have felt reliving their own 80s childhoods, real or imagined, in the earlier seasons. The trauma that Elle has spent so long blocking from her memory feels completely oppositional to the whole idea of nostalgia that the show was rooted in, and it's probably the best example of the show's evolving maturity. Of course, trauma has always undergirded Stranger Things, whether in Will's struggles to get back to real life after his time in the Upside Down, or Elle's ongoing flashbacks about being separated from her mother. But by focusing on it throughout the season, the show is taking what was subtext and making it central to the plot. It's symptomatic of Stranger Things' slow descent into a darker worldview. It's been slowly peeling back its own nostalgia like an onion to reveal the real trauma that lingers under even the happiest memories of 80s childhood. And because we'd come to love the characters as tropes from 80s films, it takes us by surprise when the show actually stops to examine their pain. And that examination, and the growth that comes with it, subverts our ultimately nostalgic view of them. It serves as a strong reminder that looking backwards as a person, or as a nation, can be as painful as it is joyous. Stranger Things seems to be earnest in its attempts at critiquing nostalgia, but ultimately, these efforts lead to a sort of internal conflict of interest. Because alongside, say, Hopper's discussion of his time in Vietnam, we still have the same nostalgic callbacks the series was originally beloved for. That's understandable. Their audience has come to expect as much from the show, but it still creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. In fact, in this season, the show even goes kind of meta with its nostalgia, featuring new flashbacks to past beloved moments from earlier in the series. This creates a sort of double nostalgia for us, a nostalgia of remembering our first time watching the show. You could argue that this is a way for the creators to demonstrate just how much things have changed, but arguably, it skirts the edge of fan service. The darker that Stranger Things goes, the more these twin threads of celebratory nostalgia and critique of nostalgia start to chafe together. So, in sum, we'd argue that Stranger Things can't really subvert the very same nostalgia it actively invokes. You can't have your nostalgia cake and critique it too. And let's face it, the show's thrills and spills escapism is why we all got hooked to begin with. If season 1 had ground to a halt to explore Joyce Byers' experience of single working-class motherhood, would we have kept watching? There's not much room in the whimsical Spielbergian paradigm for examining the full-on complexity of real-world politics, or the nuanced and highly subjective effects that they have on us as human beings. But it can do compelling character work, and we'd argue that season 4 was the best example of that. So, Stranger Things mostly remains a show that creates intertextual nostalgia to make its audience remember, or pretend they remember, the 80s. And if it happens to do so to commercial ends, then all the better to merchandise the shit out of 11, right? As historian Gary Cross puts it, all nostalgias consist of organizers and participants. But today, the organizers increasingly are marketers, and participants are consumers. That is to say, being nostalgic for an era naturally makes you more likely to buy shit that reminds you of that era. Hey, let he who lives in a glass house cast the first Walkman. But this type of nostalgia has a potentially more insidious side too. The imagined past, like those invoked in the show, are also used to fuel a political nostalgia that has real-world consequences, like a right-wing yearning for a past where America was a place full of faith, family, and straight people who own guns, or the liberal nostalgia for a world of tolerance and ethical capitalism. In both cases, this nostalgia functionally distracts us from critically evaluating the present. It convinces us that the only way forwards is backwards. It might not be a big deal when this inspires us to, say, buy a 2-liter of Coke with our Pizza Hut, but it can potentially be harmful when it starts to shape our political reality. Luckily, Stranger Things seems content to stay out of the pesky, boring politics that constitute adult life. At least for now. But what do you think? Does Stranger Things succeed at critiquing the nostalgia that it's based in? Or was season 4 a failed lab experiment? Let us know in the comments. Thanks to our patrons for all their support, and don't miss out on our new Patreon perks. And remember, you can join us every Thursday for our weekly live stream. Throw fireworks at that subscribe button like you're vanquishing an interdimensional monster, and don't forget to ring that bell. As always, thanks for watching, and good luck making that deal with God. Later.